I often find myself daydreaming about the future. Whenever I do so, I always think of images from Blade Runner, Interstellar, or Star Wars. Spaceships, flying cars, science fiction medicine, and new technologies we can't even dream of today. As we look forward and envision our world in the future, what would you say is the biggest issue that will face the human race 100 years from now? Is it war, hunger, overpopulation? We're actually today already starting to see some of the repercussions of the single greatest threat to humanity in the future, global climate change. But what is really at stake, and why should our society care? Why must we have this conversation now? Well, the strength of hurricanes has been steadily increasing. The amount of droughts and wildfires here in our own backyard all can be correlated to an increased amount of thermal energy in the atmosphere. Displacement of large groups of people will dramatically change the geopolitical landscape as areas become inhospitable due to changes in local environments. We are already seeing this start to take place. The conflict in Syria, for example, was stoked because of the lack of availability of resources like water and food. Ocean acidification will cause many aquatic ecosystems to disappear. The Great Barrier Reef, for example, has decreased by 48% over the past 26 years. I have seen these changes to reef ecosystems firsthand when I dove in the Caribbean Sea this past summer. This actually motivated me to become more involved in the conversation. And all of these issues will only compound as more time passes. Many leading climate scientists support that we have already gone beyond the point of no return, and the damage to our environment can only be slowed, not stopped. My goal here today is to provide you with the tools to have a meaningful conversation with another human being who may not share the same viewpoint as you. In our heated and politically charged society that we live in today, we must find ways to have meaningful and constructive conversations with people who disagree with us in order to make real change. It is more important now, more than ever, that we use our understanding of the nature of information and rational problem solving to drive to the debate on climate change. Before we dive into this here, we must address one fundamental idea that is broadly misunderstood by our society today. And that is, what is science? So for you, what do you think of when you think of science? For someone who does science, chances are you're probably recalling images of a scraggly older man in a white lab coat with goggles on, swirling a brightly colored liquid in an Erlenmeyer flask, looking inquisitively while he ponders the universe. This man is probably working alone on an experiment in a lab. In doing so, coming up with a hypothesis, testing his results, drawing a conclusion. Now, this image that we're used to thinking of isn't far from the truth, and is what we typically teach in schools when we discuss the scientific method. However, this fundamental picture of how science is done is missing one key piece of the scientific method, and arguably the most important component to science as we know it: peer review. Unfortunately, the process of peer review is perpetually omitted by news outlets when they report news items such as these. If you were to say, a recent science study says that you should eat chocolate once a day to reduce your chances of Alzheimer's disease. This creates an image that one study has provided us with one answer to one question. Now, these studies can be used to bolster an argument or used as evidence, but they cannot be used as the sole answer to a particular question. We must look at the broader picture and analyze all of the evidence. So this is not how science works. If someone makes a claim from their research, their findings are put through the most meticulous and critical analysis as possible by a series of people from many different backgrounds and focus areas. Their one job is to pick apart the submitted findings, to reject the results that are found to have any trace of bias or even the slightest chance of being invalidated. The end result is that any published research supported by the broader scientific community has gone through the gauntlet and stood the test of misinformation. Now, this is why science is so great. By design, the scientific community is a tool to combat against bias in information and to prevent people from using results to support their own personal agendas. This is the same scientific process that has developed modern medicine to save the lives of millions of people. It's what allows you to drive your car to work in the morning. It's how you're able to drain your brain away on Candy Crush for hours on end, using a device in your pocket with computing power thousands of times greater than the Apollo spacecraft. The reason this is important to bring up in this conversation is that in order to understand the gravity of the overwhelming results in support of climate change, you must consider the grueling process that all of the research came through, and that any results that have been published were not gathered in a partisan or biased way. This is why the scientific community has been the foundation of almost every major advancement and decision that has allowed our society to climb as far as it has. One thing I do want to reiterate before we discuss some pieces of evidence in support of climate change is that you never have to agree with the results of a science-backed study. We live in a free democracy where you can think whatever you want. The danger arises when dismissal of the credibility of information backed by the scientific community undermines the whole institution that shaped our world today and impairs the ability of that institution to develop new findings and ideas. Let's take a look at research that has been completed by NOAA, one of the world's leading organizations tasked with determining changes in the global system. So looking back through hundreds of years of ice cores, you can clearly see that during post-industrialization era in human society, there's a clear jump in the amount of carbon dioxide present in the atmosphere. Now we can see that there are clear ebb and flows in CO2 levels throughout history, but it has never climbed to these levels that we are experiencing today. Another key piece of research investigated by the NASA Goddard Institute for Space Science was the overall temperature change from an expected average over the past 100 years. Here we can see a dramatic climb in upward temperature anomalies since the 1980s. In fact, the 5 warmest years on record have taken place since 2010. 2016 was the warmest year on record. 8 of the 12 months in that year were the warmest months on record for those respective months. The evidence is clear that there is a substantial trend that can be plainly seen from these results. Now, what can you do with this information? How can you go and have a meaningful conversation about this topic? According to the American Psychological Association, you should follow these simple guidelines when having a conversation with someone who does not share the same viewpoint as you. If you have a plan going into the conversation and potentially a plan for confrontation, it will be a much less stressful experience, and you'd be less likely to devolve into a heated argument. So first, find areas where you agree. Second, be open and kind. Third, keep calm when tensions rise. Fourth, have conversation goals. Fifth, accept that you may not change the other person's mind. 6, disagreement is okay. 7, know when to end the conversation. Now that you have a plan, go out there and talk about it. It doesn't matter what your viewpoint is. The value comes from the process of talking about and working through these issues together. The only way to combat misinformation is to provide research from science-backed studies and create arguments that have an open mind but are focused on creating meaningful change. So if we shut down and don't have these conversations, and we don't get involved to make changes in our country's policies and in our local lives, we give up our control to what will happen to this planet of ours, the only home that we've ever known.